So I'll go ahead and start. I'm Mike McKenna, and I've been doing globalization since last century. The talk this morning is dealing with person names. How do you represent person names? And this is basically an update report for the CLDR subcommittee for a new proposal to have additions to CLDR for person name formatting. The last year there was a presentation which pretty much laid out what the structure was. So we talked about existing standards and why we have to deal with a person name. So in applications, you're using person names all the time. You have them with mail merge. I mean, going back to ancient history, you have them in social media. You have your friendly text that comes from your application to the individual. You have personnel databases. Salesforce will have its representation. You'll have the Little League club down the block is going to have a different representation. So there's quick overview of the problem. So out there are lots and lots of standards for how to pass information about people. There's standards on how that data is represented. There's W3C and HTML has got representation for how names, has syntax for how names should be stored and stuff. But the problem is there are no standards for how to format those names. There's no standards really available for is the given name first, is the surname first, etc. There's a few attempts at it for how to be able to represent those with the Universal Postal Union, with this incredibly complex standard that almost no applications have in place. Different industries have put their own bits in places, but there's no standard representation. There's issues in terms of how those names are actually used. Is it a formal context? Is it an informal context? How do you represent them for sorting? And what field should you have on your input form? What order should they be in, etc.? So you have a standard, there are standards for the envelope to put the information in, but there are no standards for how to represent those. And when we talked last year and was bringing into the standard this year is what order should those fields be in, what lengths, if it's the formality of the context, and also the usage. Am I talking to a person? Am I referring to a person, etc.? So the overall goal of this standard is to have a consistent method for how to format name objects and to consider the context of those name objects when you're doing the formatting. There are things that we're still under discussion about, but one of the big goals is to be able to make it so it's as compatible as possible to ubiquitous name object standards that are already in existence. For instance, in HTML5, there's a set of autocomplete field names that every browser is going to have. Most LDAP has got a set of standard elements in their name objects and so on, so that if you already have existing data that you could pretty much use the formatting standard as it evolves. So there are, so if you have contacts on your smartphones and so on, that you'd be able to cut and paste from what's in your contacts into forms, etc., depending on an application and how they use those formatting pieces. So it's currently in a proposal state. It'll be available for public review very soon. There, I have the list of editors, and we've had contributions from a number of people from CLDR subcommittees and various industries and so on. So it's important to specify what's in and what's out. So this is like the disclaimer before you hit accept. And the disclaimers have not all been formalized yet. So what is included is the structures, how to define the structures of the names. What is included is the method to determine the formats. What is included is the context in terms of lengths of names, the formality indicator, and the usage of name. If I am referring to a person, for instance, that is Texan over there versus hi Mark. So there's two different references, and I'll show some examples later on why that is important. And also, what format do you use for sorting of the name? If it's going to be sorted in an indexed list, if it's going to be telephone order, etc. There is the provision that in the future, so this is like a version 1, in the future there could be additional versions that add additional context or constructs based on feedback from the community. But what is not included? So it does not include any knowledge of the linguistic aspects of the locale that you're in. It does not understand inflections. It doesn't have any knowledge of that. It's primarily the syntax of the name, not the linguistic grammar of the name. It does not have any understanding of context-specific cultural aspects. For instance, in Japanese, you might use san or sama, depending on the formality and referring to an individual. It doesn't have that included. It doesn't have any knowledge of gender. That would be in a person object, not a person name object. Since it has no knowledge of gender, it cannot proactively choose prefixes like a Mr. or Ms. or in Arabic a bin or a bint to refer to son of or daughter of. It currently does not have, because it's not in the ubiquitous standards, the concept of surname prefixes or affixes. So example is in Dutch, it's real common to have an extra field for, I also have to look at this, the tussenvoegsel, which is the prefix to the name. Like in Van der Poel, Van der would be a tussenvogel. We would just look at Van der Poel, or however it's sent in as an element to be formatted. It doesn't have a nickname field, and we'll talk about how that would be handled. For instance, if you have Dwayne Johnson, we don't have a method to have Dwayne The Rock Johnson in quotes unless the application did that beforehand and passed it in at this point. It has, at this point, there's no concept of validations, like what names are required or are not required, other than we have, I think, a requirement. You have to at least have a given name or surname field, but we don't tell you which one. And I don't think we have a specific requirement in the DTD for that, but we don't do validations. For instance, what script, if you want to put Latin characters and format them in Japanese, there's no validation for that. It'll just do the syntax and put them in the order that you ask for. It doesn't understand parsing of a full name. For instance, if you have Mary Jean Williams Sonoma, it doesn't know if, and it's sent as a full string, it doesn't know if Jean is a middle name or part of the given name, or Williams and Sonoma, if the Williams belongs as part of the middle name, or Williams Sonoma is all a surname. It has no knowledge of that. And that's actually a pretty tricky field to get into, to do the parsing of names into its individual parts. And there are cases where you have honorifics before a name and titles after a name when you want to add or subtract those. For instance, you may have in German, Herr Doktor. It just sees that as a prefix for right now. It would be up to the application to know that when you want to just use Herr Schmidt versus Herr Dr. Schmidt versus Dr. Schmidt. because there are different contexts, and all it knows is because the ubiquitous name object standards only have prefix. It doesn't have multiple prefixes. So a person name object is part of what we've defined, that whatever your application is, it decides how to get from the data into an object, which has got fields of prefix, given, middle, surname. We also have a surname too. This is just an example. Suffix. And there are some like selector attributes that might be part of your data that can get passed in. The primary name fields are compatible with the W3C, HTML, autocomplete fields, etc. So the fields we have to describe for a name object that goes in are your prefix, so that would be in English like your Mr. or Mrs., etc. Your given name, the middle name if it's present in your particular locale, surname, and a nod to surname 2 because it's been found in lots of places, and we're seeing that in HR databases and things of that sort, and also as a requirement for legal names in a number of Hispanic regions. And then you'll see it's also required to be able to support the forenames, which are in Saudi Arabia and various Arabic locales. And then suffix, which could be it's typically like a generation indicator, like a junior or the third, or professional titles like MBA, Esquire, etc. So how do you handle nickname or other fields or other representations that are vastly different? So let's say you had Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. In a lot of HR databases and what we've seen in systems, that they do have name objects that will have a nickname field, and they just make the blanket assumption that nickname only applies to the given name. But there are lots of cases where a person wants to use their middle name as their first name. So I have someone in my family, his name is Peter Marcus Barza, and he does not like the word name Peter, so it goes by Marcus Barza, or it comes as P. Marcus Barza. And you go, well, which one is the preferred name? And so we didn't want to step in and make assumptions for where that nickname field goes. And so that might be enhancements later on. But your data does have that information, and therefore various permutations. So I have an example. Let's say you have a Ms. Elizabeth Jolene Smith, Esquire, and has a locale in the US, English in the US. She may have a preferred name of Beth, where your application goes ahead, fills in the name. So now given name is Beth, which then can be passed on. And your application may say, she never uses Jolene, she likes to have J, so it'd be like Beth J. Smith. And she may also have an AKA name that's in your database that there may be instances. So we don't have any knowledge of what the different variations of names are in your data, but you do. So your application then picks the names according to your data to put into a name object to then be formatted. So that makes sense. In Japanese, for instance, it's very common when you enter your name in Japanese, you're also expected to enter a name in the phonetic representation. So you'll already have two name objects. And then for international transactions, credit card, bank wires, etc., you are required oftentimes to have a Latin name. So that's another name object. So it's up to your application to decide. But interesting thing on tracking the application, if you notice the locale fields on the bottom of the Japanese object, you know when you have Japanese in Japan, but now you have Latin, you go, well, it's Japanese, but I have a different script and so on. So there's a tag that is being recommended to use UND for undefined or undetermined language, for instance. So I know this is for Japan, but it's undefined. So if that field, for instance, can be passed on into other locales. For instance, I'm formatting in the US, and now I have a name that comes in from Japan. I don't have to know the language, but I know the original content comes from Japan. We'll take a look at how that would work. If you have more elements than there are available fields, your application will be responsible at this point to combine them correctly. For instance, the Dutch case where you have Vincent van Gogh in a Dutch database, van and go would be two different columns in the database, but you would combine those to then present them as like Van Gogh, if that's how you want to do the formatting, and that would be formatted according to the surnames. And your application may choose a different combination, for instance, when passing for sorting. If you wanted to do the sort combinations, because in the Netherlands, you'll sort based on the surname without the Tussenvogel. So your application will have to make that determination. So once you have your name object and the various fields determined, then they can be submitted for formatting. So there are various elements in how those formats are described. There is a container field called person names, plural, and that will contain two parts inside of it. One is name order, which has a default, if not specified, which has given name first, and also allows you can specify other elements in your larger person names object that you may have some that if it gets passed in from the application to say, I know you're formatting for the US, but this name format with surname first. And we'll show us a small example with that. And then you can have one or more person name format objects or elements inside of it. So the name order is, again, optional. So the attributes that can be assigned to a name format is length, style, usage, and order. And we'll talk about each one of these and going a little bit as we dive into them. So the first one is length. And the ones based on what we've seen in the industry and the most common usage is long, medium, short, monogram, and monogram narrow. So long would be the full name with all the different elements presented as what makes sense. Medium is a little bit shorter. So examples we use, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Like John Kennedy, you might have a short name. Like on your tag, it might say, my name is John. Monogram would be usual case for like initials. Depending on feedback that we get, right now we have it as, example here is 3 initials, but like when you see the machine-generated avatars, which is just the letters, when you're in a text orientation, you might just see a single letter for the person's name, or might see 2 letters that are auto-generated for the person's name. That's the context here for being able to do auto-generate person script avatars, or in other cases you want to have very short versions of an individual, like if depending on the application. The next attribute is usage, and with usage we have the concept of addressing, where I am talking to a person, referring, where I'm talking about a person. Before we had the terms vocative and nominative, but we thought it'd be more user-friendly to use very clearly, I'm addressing a person, I'm referring to a person, or I'm sorting a list of names. So examples, I'm talking to John. So, hi, John. or this is John Kennedy. Or I'm going to sort the name, I want to look at it sort it as Kennedy, comma, John. So if I have a sorted list of names, it would be able to be represented and then use the collation algorithms to sort these appropriately. The next attribute is style, and the two styles that we indicated is informal and formal. We realize that in some languages there are multiple levels of style. For instance, in Japanese, where I'm talking to a child, I'm talking to a peer, I'm talking to a superior, I'm talking to the emperor. We don't quite have that delineation, but we do have formal and informal, because those are pretty clearly indicated in all the different references that we can find about names and how to represent the names and how to present them. Did exhaustive research into style guides, Wikipedia style guides, looked at United Nations style guides, European Union style guides, the government printing office style guides. Then there's a number of etiquette style guides, which we have not gotten anywhere close to doing an exhaustive research on the etiquette aspects of it. But with these two different attributes, you have a large number of combinations that would then be available to make it more straightforward for your application to choose, oh, I am generating a diploma for somebody, I want to use a formal style. Oh, I am talking in a friendly tone of voice to an individual in a notification, I want to use an informal style, and be able to use the permutations of the other attributes along with it. The final one is order, and order is an optional field, and this is something that can show up, for instance, recently with the Olympics in Japan. And the government of Japan said, for all the other nations, you decide how you want to present your athletes. Most of them would be given name first with surname afterwards. In Japan, they said we want Japanese names to be represented with the surname first, all in capitals, with the given name afterwards. And so by being able to indicate with the order field, you can indicate to the format, and then within the format objects, if we have a order format in place that is different from the default, then it can select that and be able to present it accordingly. So so then, once you have the attributes to define a particular person name format, then you have the formats themselves, which is basically composed of a list of fields with the field names with literals in between if needed. So example, with the sorting format here, you'd have surname, and then you have the literal, comma, space, given with a space, middle, and then the end of the element that's in place. So that you drop the name in, and it would just drop in the formatter based on the objects, and then be able to present it accordingly, according to the format as specified. Each one of the format elements can be modified, and we have two modifiers right now. One is pretty straightforward, all caps. So for instance, the example from Japan, if I have Hayao Miyazaki in surname first, will be presented as Miyazaki Hayao, or I have surname all caps. And then we have initial. Right now, we have, in the proposal that we have together right now, we only choose the first grapheme in the string that's been passed. So if there are multiple words in the string that's been passed, we'll only take the first word in that name element and then present it. So for instance, example here, if you're doing the monogram syntax, it might have given name, initial, middle, or given initial, middle, initial, surname, initial, and so a previous past president, and you come back with his initials, LBJ, all, and based on what the values are. Since we did not, in the example I gave here, I don't have all caps. If the person that comes in the data in lowercase, it'll just get formatted as lowercase. If the desire in the format is to have it in capitals, then that has to be part of the format. To say the field name, all caps, initial, and then that appropriate formatting would take place on top of the first grapheme that's been put in. This is just a quick overview in extended BNF form of how it's composed together. That in essence, we have the zero or more modifiers, one or more of the field names, and then any literals that are in between. So I don't expect you to read all of that. But the fun part is you have a whole list of formats, and you go, well, how do I choose which person name format to actually use? In the person name, it has, you have length, you have usage, you have style, potentially ordering. There can be more than one name pattern within a person name, so person name object. So you have person names, plural, which contains multiple person name sets, and each one of those can have multiple name formats, at least one, but can have more than one name format. And then there's an algorithm that's defined on how to choose which name pattern that is in it. So as an example, here's a hypothetical case where here we have the multiple person names, and it contains the first person name and saying, if you're asking for long, referring, and formal, there's a particular name pattern. And then you may have long, referring, informal. And then down below, we've got long, sorting, informal. So informal may or may not be listed. So that makes it pretty straightforward that based on the list of attributes, if you've specified all the attributes, then it will choose whichever one has the attributes that you have. So we'll go into a bit more examples of, well, what happens if it has not been defined? How do I choose the correct one that is in place? So here's an example request. I'm asking for long, referring, formal. And if the formats I hit actually have long, referring, and formal, I have a match, so I'll go ahead and use that. But if that isn't defined, and I see, let's say, long, referring, informal, I don't have a match, so I'd have to skip that. If I saw long and I can have a set of attributes, space-separated set, I see long, addressing, referring, formal. I see referring in there, so that becomes a match. I could use that. Now, if those weren't defined and I just see long, formal, I don't see the usage as referring or addressing. If I don't see anything, then it matches everything. So that would be a match as well. So there's different, so that way the linguist or whoever is actually helping us to create the formats for the different locales doesn't have to do every single permutation of the now 4 different attributes that you have in place. If, for instance, you have the sorting format and it's the same no matter what, you only need one and it'll just fall back just to that one. And we have one more, which is if you have nothing specified, that's the fallback that everything gets. So if you have sparse name objects, so let's say the name fields that comes from your application into the name object, not every field is populated. So how do you handle that? And then choosing which format to use. So let's say we have an example. The pattern is prefix given, my middle initial, and I just happen to have a comma in there, surname, comma, suffix, just putting the commas in just for the illustration purposes on what happens. And I have a person that I'm dropping in, Herrn Albert Ludwig Philipp Schweitzer, OM. And how would that get represented? As Herrn Albert L. Schweitzer, OM. But let's say I don't have the suffix now, then what would happen is I would get the, missing the prefix and the suffix, I now would drop those along with any spaces up to the next field. So now I have the prefix space is dropped, and then I have the comma space. I'm dropping everything up to the field from the outside in. So suffix, space, comma, all that would get dropped. And I hit the field, then I stop the first populated field. And then I have, what if I have only Albert Schweitzer? I don't have the middle name. Then what would happen is I, again, trim from the outside in, and then I take the field that is missing and any literals up to the next space or whatever the space, white space indicator is, or field, whichever I hit first. And here I would end up potentially with multiple white spaces and dedupe any white space that you have in between. So it's not perfect, and we understand that it's not perfect, so that allows you to, so that's why we have it so you can set up multiple name objects, because there can be cases where if you have a sparse name object that drops in, that potentially the way that the fields will combine together, that you're going to have some weird pattern of literals that's going to look strange to the user. So giving an example here, where just for illustration, there's no white space, and I have a comma, open guillemot, middle, close guillemot, surname. And let's say if the middle was missing, I don't want to have this weird comma in there that would, because I would just take, normally if I'm missing the given, in this case, I would clear everything up to the first non-space literal, and I'd have a comma guillemot, which will look really strange. So I have another one, which is just middle surname. So if the sparse field, if I have the given middle surname are all populated, then I would go ahead and choose the first format, and I would get the ipsum lorem dolor that I have. If the given is missing, I just have the middle, then I would use it's not populated, so I would drop down to the second name format, then it allows me to have proper looking formats. And if I have only the given and the surname, then it will go ahead and choose probably the first one, which is then going to drop all the punctuation up to the next white space or element, which is then going to combine them and smash them together, and you go, oops, that's not what I want. So then that means that as a creator for the formats, I'll want to create another format to add in, which would then take care of that when then, let's say, I just want to have the given comma surname. So that way, that allows the creators to create different permutations of the formats in special cases where the standard truncation and sparse name field algorithm won't work. So the name order data, it's this would be a parallel set. We'll figure out where that would go, that for a particular set of name locales, so let's say I'm in France, or I have a set of name locales. Example is for Japanese, basically your CJK regions plus Hungarian, and then you see the UND, HK, UND, Monaco, I guess. No, that's Mongolia. No, Is that right? Yeah. And then UND Hungarian. Those are where I don't know what the language or script is, but I know what the region is. And the bit above for language, and then anyone from Japan, anyone from Taiwan. I have an order of surname first. So then if I see that a locale that's been passed in for the name object is from one of these regions, then I can look for a surname first ordering in my name formats. So the reason why I want it to be looking in my name, my formats, let's say I'm formatting for the US, I don't necessarily want to use the specific go to the Japanese name formats. I want to look for the surname first format in my US name formats, because I may want to specify I always have a space between the fields, because I don't know if they're passing in Latin, I don't know if they're passing in Japanese, etc. So going into some examples. So here's one for the US, and I'll use the this individual's doctor, so it's doctor, and then we have Jonas Edward Salk, MD. For monograms, you can see how using the formality makes a difference. So the first one is a monogram formality, informal, and you'll see I've got length and style, but I don't have usage in here. So that means usage will match anything if you happen to be a monogram. So informal would just take the initial of the given name. Then if I have next one to drop down, still is monogram narrow, and all it says is length monogram narrow. So what happens if I have a formal, if they want to say, no, I want to do monogram narrow formal. Well, since it's not informal, I don't see the style, so style matches everything, so that would be the formal reference. And that would drop down, and so that would take the, in this case, it's the initial of the surname. And then if I want to do monogram, I want to do multiple initials. In this case, we're just going the initial of the given name, initial of the surname, and there's no reference to usage or style. So this will work if they're asking for a length of monogram. It doesn't matter if they're asking for formal or informal, it'll match all of them. So that way you can have a sparse number of name formats, don't have to have them fully populated. And so this is all you would need to handle all of the monogram narrow and monogram cases here. Example of short, and let's say I am, I actually should have the usage of addressing on here. Oops, I forgot to add that. So I have a person name, short and formal case, and I'm addressing the individual. So actually, if it's referring or addressing in this case, I could refer to them, let me introduce you to Dr. Salk, or glad to meet you, Dr. Salk. It works for both cases, referring as well as addressing. But then you want to go to the first one above is short formal. Now I'm asking for informal. And it doesn't matter if I'm asking for addressing or referring, I'm going to just use their given name. Let me introduce you to Jonas. Glad to meet you, Jonas. Both cases will work. And since the attributes aren't in the name format specifier, it'll select for any of them once you've gone past formal. Medium is another example where, let's say I'm asking for sorting. Medium, I'll just want to go by surname, then comma, given name. Then for the length, if I have formal, now this is where it gets interesting. According to one of the etiquette guides that we saw, if a person has a professional name honorific and they have a professional title, you never see both in the same name. You would not have someone as Dr. Salk, MD, because the redundancy, it would be when you speak to the person, you say, glad to meet you, Dr. Salk. I wouldn't say glad to meet you, Salk MD. But I would refer to them on a list, statements and so on, that this is Jonas Salk MD. I'm referring to the individual. So this is the case here where it's medium formal, and then I have just medium. So medium formal, so I can refer to, this should actually be referring, because it's Jonas Salk MD, and then the next one down is medium, is Jonas Salk for the medium case. If I'm just, this is Jonas Salk, or glad to meet you, Jonas Salk. So this one I got it right here. So another case in long, sorting, for instance, I may want to have the full, thank you, full representation, Salk, Jonas Edward MD. But if I'm referring to them, I'd say Jonas Edward Salk MD. So that might be what would be on a statement, maybe a recognition or award or something. But then when addressing the individual, then the long form would be like Dr. Jonas E. Salk. And so that way you can have different name formats to address the different attributes. And then with the fallback, if using the attributes, fully specified attributes, if it's not fully, if one of the attributes is missing, it matches all, or it can be a set of attributes. Final one would be like a fallback. This would be its person name with no attributes whatsoever, and it would just drop right in. And this is a case where you may end up with the Dr. Jonas Edward Salk MD, which may be incorrect for the representation that you're looking at. Go real quick through a few of these. This is a Spanish case. You may have heard of Guillermo del Toro. He's from Mexico. His full name is Guillermo del Toro Gomez is his second surname. He has a nickname of Totoro, which I just threw in here for illustration purpose, but he may want to have middle initials of lowercase d, uppercase t. And so this is an illustration of where the name object that's passed in could have like an override, a way to specify it. So in this case, I have it a surname dash initial. So when a name object is passed in for formatting, we see the monogram and its surname initial for the just surname in this case, then it would take what's come in from the name object. Otherwise, we would just take lowercase d with the standard algorithm, but if it's passed in as a name object, we would then present the dt. With the monogram format, you can see how the dt is dropped in, and then in Mexico, we may want, in a formal case, adding both the surname and the surname to initials. So you would have the given surname and surname to initials. So it'd be the G, DT, G, as opposed to a informal, because we don't have a formal match, just GDT, okay? And here's an example of where surname to might drop in for Spanish and Mexico formats, where if you have a formal Del Toro Gomez, and then in addressing, be like Senor Del Toro, and that would be, let's say, the formal representation, and the short name as the informal would just be Guillermo. And then another few examples with representation, bringing in the second surname, and then in the long formats, showing all the way down until you get to the fallback, which then will have everything in place. So then the last one to jump through pretty quick is example using Japanese. This is Professor Jigoro Kano, who is the founder, since Japan just hosted the Olympics, he's the founder of judo. His name would be represented in Japanese as Kano Jigoro, with the surname first. And in this case, he was a professor. So the suffix here is the professor's name. So it's Kano Jigoro and then professor. So the monogram, we show how you might have formal with the surname. Informal might be just the given name. And here's short name giving just the surname plus the suffix is the top one, and then examples of formal and informal. Medium might be the surname given suffix for the full professor, and then long, you can see all of these are the same, and we potentially could have just gotten rid of long and just dropped right down to the fallback, because they all look exactly the same. Sample API would have representations for how I handle the modifiers, the name formats, usage, and so on, to be able to then drop in a name object. So we've been walking through, there's a number of open issues in that we can't handle gender issues, we can't handle the name prefixes. It's a little clunky for right now how to handle initials. So for instance, J.R.R. Tolkien, they would have to pass in R.R. to get the double R for a middle name if they wanted to have the full initials properly represented. There are some interesting linguistic issues, for instance, with Greek initials that take into consideration the following vowel. So it's not necessarily just the first grapheme. And we're still working out, for instance, in Arabic locales, how do we handle the ordering when you have the given name, father's name, grandfather's name, family name. Is the surname 2 at the end, or is the surname going to be the family name, or is the surname going to be the father's name, etc.? So the next steps, just a few minutes, is to get this out for review and comment, get a reference app built, get updates based on the review comments, approval, beta release, and then continue to improvement. So Tex, take it away with questions, I guess.
Yeah, so are there any questions? Is there a microphone for, we'll let Mike repeat your question over the video. So, I'm interested in two things. One is for monograms, what do you do with somebody who's an esquire or a junior or a third? That should be a part of the monogram, I would think. And the other question is when people type their name, some cultures type their family name in all uppercase. You showed that as part of the display. But when you're accepting data, do you lowercase it, or how do you manage that? Because you have to deal with cases. And you showed like Del Toro with lowercase. So when you accept data, what do you do for standardizing the representation?
Okay, so two questions. So the first question is, a generation suffix might want to be added to a prefix, such as John William III. So right now we're looking at if whatever's in the format, that's what we do. So the format specifies to take the suffix and add it on and do Esquire, then it would have to be in the format itself. And if you ask for an initial, and if it's John William III, we'll just take the letter I, is currently how it's specified. So that would be broken if that's a requirement. The second part has to do is how do we handle the names as their input? Do we do any casing on the way in or normalization? The current proposal is that whatever data you pass in is the data we use. So if it's passed in all lowercase, that's what will get formatted. We'll only take what's in the format specifier. If the specifier says to transform it to all uppercase, then that's what we'll do. We don't have like a specification to force to sentence case, for instance, or to force to lowercase. Yeah, question?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. It's pretty unusual for people to use junior in their monograms. John Williams Jr. you usually don't see as JWJ. I don't think that certainly was not a requirement.
Yeah, I could see if you were putting it on your shirt or something, but if you were identifying people in a group and there were a lot of family there, you might want to distinguish that. But it's fine. You know, it's whatever it's called for.
I mean, we've not handled all permutations, including...
I'm not criticizing.
That's okay. So we had Rich has hand up first.
I was just going to say that the monogram
you speak a little louder, generating what?
Chubb,
Chat avatars, and other stuff like that, where, you know, normally you'd have a picture of somebody, in this case you don't have their picture, so you use their initial. That was sort of the application you had in mind.
Not for invitation.
right, not, yeah, so the discussion for those listening in on the recording video, it's not so much monograms weren't intended to like put monograms for on your shirts and stuff, but to generate chat avatars. So in the example I skimmed through really quick for Japanese, for instance, it showed the monogram was the name in Japanese. It wasn't necessarily the first grapheme. So it was like a two-letter Japanese name, a two-character Japanese name. You got the two characters, and that's what would appear, for instance, in the chat avatar. That's in place. You had your question up first after that.
Would any of the fields have overrides?
Would any of the fields have overrides? You mean from the data passed in from the application? I don't see any reason why not. Mark?
Yeah, basically the way it's constructed is we have the formatting data, and then we have a name object, and they can interact. So the formatting data can say, well, for the things that are desired to be formatted, we need a middle initial, and it asks the name object for the middle initial. The name object can be arbitrarily complex. It could just suck things out of the database, or it could say, oh, I know how to construct this. You know, my company constructs middle initials in a weird way. I'm going to do this. So the name object can override anything and then hand back. If the name object hands back and says, you know, I don't construct the middle initial, do the default, then the formatting would just say first graphic. You got it.
So we do need to let the room be updated for the next speaker. Let's thank Mike for a fantastic presentation.